Hello and welcome to our next class in the pastor's class. Today we are moving beyond the 10 commandments and we are moving into the creeds. Now we're going to see a transition from that which was law, right, which God calls for us to do and how we are to live, to now seeing in the creed what we know as the gospel. That is what God has done for you. And so it's going to be our joy to kind of dig into these creeds and learn a little bit about them. So let's see. So the first one that we're going to let's see, and you can tell, yes, I've had some interesting music choices over the years. But so we're moving, right, said from law to gospel. And so when we're going to talk about a creed, we need to know what a creed is, right? And so creed comes from the Latin word meaning to believe. And so a creed then is a statement of belief, not at all connected with a band from the 90s that some of you may or may not know. But it is a confession of faith, and it's not only a private confession. I mean, it can be, certainly, but it also has a corporate component to it as well. And so it is a common or a communal faith. We would like to also use the word ecumenical, or even a small c Catholic, right? So not the Roman Catholic Church, but the word kataholu in the Greek, meaning according to the whole, that this is what Christians believe. And so, I'm giving away my answers already. All right, let's keep going. We've got 3 of them, though. And so the first creed that we'd like to talk about is the Apostles' Creed. This will be the one that we're going to work through and examine in the matter of this video. Not the whole thing today. We're just going to look at the first article. But this one it's called the Apostles. It is not from the Apostles, which is to say you're not going to find it written down or spelled out anywhere in the Bible, but it is named after them because it is in keeping with what they taught. And so that's one of the first things that you'll notice about the creeds, right? While all of the words that are laid out there, you will not find it, spelled out like you will like the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, but you will find all of the different teachings that it confesses in the scriptures. And so the Apostles' Creed is the first one. The second one, a little longer, is the Nicene, and that's a statement of faith from the Council of Nicaea. Did a video on church history about that not too long ago. And then also from Constantinople, and those happened back in 325 and 381 AD. Now those creeds, or that creed in particular, was assembled because there were questions about what is the Christian faith. And so they got together a bunch of church leaders from across the Roman Empire to sit down and hash out what does the Bible actually teach. And so they rejected a man by the name of Arius, and that's his teachings are still around today, but that's a longer talk. All right, and then the third one is the Athanasian, and this is named after the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, in honor of his fight against Arius's followers. The Arians did not like Athanasius. Boy, they put him through the ringer as he tried to teach and confess boldly what the Bible taught. One of the things I love about Athanasius' story, how many times do you think a person can be exiled from a city? Reason would say once, right? I mean that if you get kicked out once, chances are you're not getting back in. Athanasius was exiled 5 times from his city because the Arians would come into power and they would raise a stink about him being there, and so he'd be exiled and he'd be kicked out of the city, and then once the Arians got out of power, he could come back in and continue to teach. There's even one of the rumors, from years back, or the legends about him is that, when he's standing there at the dock and he's wishing them farewell, he waves to them goodbye and he tells them, fear not, this too shall pass. And he goes down the river a ways. And then the soldiers, they charge up to the dock because they're like, no, we need to throw this man in jail, right? He's done this before. So they hop in a boat and they start racing down the river to catch Athanasius. Well, Athanasius has had his men turn the boat around, and his plan is to sail back into the city and set up a church underground. And so as the story goes, those soldiers are racing past the boat that has Athanasius on it, and they call out to him and they say, hey, Have you seen Athanasius? And Athanasius' response is, yes, he is very near indeed. And they just keep on going downriver, and Athanasius then makes it back into the city. So, but quite the character if you ever get a chance to read his stuff. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about him and his defense of the incarnation further on. So when we talk about the creeds, most of us are familiar with the apostles. Most are familiar with the Nicene, and you'll hear those two pretty much every other Sunday. I mean, that we bounce back and forth between those two creeds. The one that you will hear only once a year is that Athanasian Creed, and that is because it is something else. So I would encourage you, I know we're doing this class online, so you might not be able to get it, in a hymnal, but to look up the Athanasian Creed online. Pause the video, check it out. You will find it on page 319 in the hymnal. And as you can tell, this creed, right, it starts on this page going through, and then you have to turn the page because it's not done. And so, right here, there we are. And so Athanasius, I mean, this creed was, it's spelled out clearly that we believe in the Trinity, the triune God, 3 persons, 1 divine essence. And it spells out all those ways in which people have tried to get around the Trinity and kind of corrupt the teaching of who God is, and it shuts them all down. So it's a good creed. We only say it once a year, Holy Trinity Sunday. And that is the Sunday after Pentecost. So when Pentecost comes, be ready. But when we talk about a creed, right, what is the value of having a creed? Well, a creed is something that helps us out, first and foremost, as a way to teach the faith. When you're teaching the creed to your kids, right, you go through it over and over again, and you say it over and over again. And then once the kids have it committed to memory, or once you yourself have it committed to memory, you can then sit down and think about all of those words. This is a different way of learning than we have, nowadays. Most people think that memory work is only about memorizing something for a test and then being done with it and kind of casting it off to the side. But when we want to memorize the creed, we want it so that we can sit down and think about it. So we can kind of think through what are each one of these things, what do they mean, right? The reason why you should memorize the 10 Commandments and the meanings for those is so that way they can, have a place within your life and stick with you. Because what we memorize is what we use to kind of guide our thoughts and how we operate. Now, if you are like me, you have probably a lot of music memorized. In my case, the 80s, not a good age, but yeah, I mean, I don't want to be making my decisions based off lyrics from the songs of the 80s. And so I need to commit some stuff to memory so that way I make decisions based upon stuff that's good, right, and true. And so the creed, good thing to memorize, to keep with you. It helps teach the faith and keep the faith with you. The other thing is, it's a quick way to say what you believe. I mean, if people ask you, well, what does your church teach? You can say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, right? I mean, you just can go on from there and let them know what the church teaches. Right? And that way you don't have to try to scramble and find where all these verses are in the Bible. You hope the person goes and looks them up. You've got the creed, and you can get it said in 30 seconds to a minute, right? I mean, and you're all good to go. They'll know what you believe. Of course, unless you're saying the Athanasian Creed, but I mean, if you've got friends who are sticking around for that, I mean, they're probably, that's a good group. And so, once again, as I said, right, the creed is found nowhere in Scripture, and yet it teaches what Scripture teaches. And we're going to find that out as we look at this creed, to understand what God has revealed, to us through the Scriptures and how we can share it with others. And it's also then a good test to see if someone believes the Bible, because any Christian should not have a problem with the creeds. Now, that is going to throw some people off when they hear that, because their churches don't say the creeds. And they've never heard of the Athanasian Creed or the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. but hopefully, even if they've never heard them before, when they get a chance to sit down and read them, or you share them with them, that they can say, well, yeah, that's what I believe, right? I mean, because it lays out very clearly and succinctly what the Bible teaches. And if somebody disagrees with the creed, then they're disagreeing with what the Bible teaches, because the creeds just come from the Bible. All right. So with that, let's jump into the Apostles' Creed here. And so the Apostles' Creed, first article, starts off with, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. It's nice, it's short, it's simple. Now, you know, as we've been working through with Luther, that Luther's going to have some things to say about this Apostles' Creed. And so what does this mean? Well, it means I believe that God has made me and all creatures, that he has given me my body and soul, eyes, ears, and all my members, my reason and all my senses, and still takes care of them. He also gives me clothing and shoes, food and drink, house and home, wife and children, land, animals, and all I have. He richly and daily provides me with all that I need to support this body and life. Right, so right there, okay, we're not done yet, because of course Luther will be thorough. And then it says he defends me against all danger and guards and protects me from all evil. All this he does only out of fatherly divine goodness and mercy, without any merit or worthiness in me. For all this it is my duty to thank and praise, serve and obey him. This is most certainly true. All right, so right there, right, nice little, I mean, the sentence is quite short for the article, but, you know, Luther expands upon that, so we know what this all entails. And it includes a lot more than we anticipate. And so that first part we're going to talk about, that God has made me and all creatures. This is a big one that we got to discuss and understand. Did God really do all of this? Did he create all things? Right, and this comes down to the question of evolution or creation, and which side you're going to kind of fall on. And so we understand this debate. It's important for us to understand what science is, in order that we might be able to evaluate the claims that that people are coming to us with, and they're saying that this is science, especially when we contradict what it is that they believe and what the majority of the world is kind of latched on to. So science itself is built upon a philosophy called empiricism. Now, what is empiricism? Empiricism is the doctrine that all knowledge of matters of fact derives from experience, and that the mind is not furnished with a set of concepts in advance of experience. All right, so this is a fancy way of saying, right, that until you observe something, then you don't know necessarily what it's going to do, right? You can make theories, you can make observations, but you cannot prove it until you can do it. And so I can theorize, right, that from my past experiences that this pen, when I let it go, will hit the desk, right? And then I can test my theory, and I can see whether or not it's true. Look at that, hit the desk. And so this is where we get, right, the law of gravity, right? That stuff attracts to each other, you know, and the greater mass pulls the smaller mass to it. And so we have this wonderful system called empiricism. Now, is it an effective method? And we would say yes. Right? I mean, think about cell phones and the transition that cell phones have gone through. I mean, look at that first phone. You could beat somebody to death with that thing. It's huge. And then it got a little smaller, right? I mean, that one will actually fit in your pocket. And then it kept on going on, smaller and smaller, right? You'll notice we got the flip phone. I think we missed those. They're kind of fun to flip open, you know, you feel like you're in Star Trek. And then you'll notice there's a big transition there. Science figured out how to etch antennas onto circuit boards, right? Wonderful. And it kept on going till we get something like the iPhone, and then finally we move on to, right, the what is it? That was a Google Android phone. All right, so we've seen some tremendous progress take place over the last, I mean, when you think about cell phones going back to 88, 87, 89, somewhere in there. but that is the span of about 30 years. There's some amazing advancements in technology between those ages. And so empiricism is really good because you can improve upon the results that you get, as long as you keep testing and keep exploring and keep figuring out what's going on. And so, but the trick is that empiricism does have a limit. And this is where, as much as I love science, and don't get me wrong, I took as many science classes as I can. I wanted to be a geneticist. I mean, I love science. When the foundation for empiricism is experience, right? That which can be determined by observers, in their five senses, or recorded by machines, this limits it, right? There's a boundary that it cannot cross. And so, for instance, let's say you walk into a room and there is a candle burning on the table. All right, you got that picture in your mind, right? The candle is sitting there burning on the table, and then I ask you the question, how long has the candle been burning? All right, now there's kind of the question, right? I mean, if all you've got is the candle and the table, I mean, you can measure all sorts of stuff. You can measure how fast the candle burns. You can see how much wax kind of falls to the side of it. You can, you can do all sorts of measurements and examine these things and measure it in the present moment. The question that we need answered is, how tall was the candle to begin with? And that is an answer that is locked away in the past. And if there was nobody there to observe it, then we don't have the answer. So don't get me wrong, I love science. I do. I enjoy all sorts of nerdy and technological oriented things. But it's got limits, and we got to recognize those limits. So then, right, I just gave this answer, right? It records what happens in the present and does not record what happens in the past. And then if there's nobody to record the past, what can it tell us about it, right? Nothing. So they can theorize, they can make observations, but they can't speak with definites, right? This is all we were just talking about. Now, that's where they have this trouble with looking back to the beginning of time. Now, for us as Christians, can we prove creation? Not empirically, right? Because you and I, we weren't there to observe it. So we cannot also repeat the experiment, right? That's the other thing with evolution, the Big Bang Theory. They got to repeat the experiment, right? And to repeat the experiment, they have to know the initial conditions. How are you going to do that? So, right, this is just looking at the reason and looking at the philosophy behind it. Now, but the reason that we trust the scriptures and go with what the Bible says, that God created all things in just 6 days, is because the man who rose from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, believes them, right? He cites them in Matthew chapter 19, verse 4. He says, have you not read that from the beginning God created them male and female? From the beginning, right? He cites Genesis, and he cites what God did in creation. So why should you believe that the whole world was created? When science can't prove that it was evolved, when we can't, scientifically prove that it was created, and that's because the man who rose from the dead believes that it was created. That's the heart of it. Right? I mean, why you should stand by creation. Right? Science can't prove it, they can't verify it, but you know what? We know that Christ is risen, so I'm going to stick with Jesus. And this is why too, right? In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, that great chapter that's all about the stuff that we believe by faith, that we believe by faith that the world was created out of nothing, right? And so that is a teaching of the Christian church, that God is our creator, right? Our maker. And this is something that has been going on and been debated for a long time. So we'll get into that in just a second. And when you try to compare, because there are some folks who try to harmonize these two things and make them compatible. If you look at the difference between evolution versus creation, right? Evolution starts with a big bang, right? And then you have the heat and the chaos. Then stars are formed from cosmic gases. Planets form as asteroids are stabilized when grabbed by stars' gravity. Life is brought forth from nothing over millions of years. Cells go from singular to multicellular. And plants and critters start to grow, and over enough years man develops, right? That's what they have presented to us. Creation, God speaks, and bam, I get that parallel there. Anyway, there the earth and waters were, and light and darkness. And then God creates the sky. He creates the land and planets, creates the sun, moon, and stars, creates the sea, critters and birds, beasts and lizards, and man. And that all happens in 6 days. It's pretty wild to believe, right? And that is something where, can we prove it? Not empirically, not scientifically, but we will stick with Jesus. And that's something where, and I always joke with folks. I say, look, said, if you want me to believe in something else, right? I mean, then you rise from the dead. I'll help you with step 1, but step 2 is on your own. No one takes me up on that. But as you compare this to, you'll notice that there are some big differences, and that these things can't be harmonized. For instance, right, the Big Bang, right? You got the heat, the chaos, stars forming first, and then the planets. And when God speaks, there He made the earth and the waters and light and darkness, right? And then after that, He created the sky, which means He put an atmosphere around the planet. All right, and then He created the land on the 3rd day, and the plants, right? Whereas, right, the plants start to develop way down there on the list, and then after He's created the land and the plants, then He makes the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then He finally makes the animals, right? Those following 2 days. So they cannot. They are not compatible, right? You can't mesh these two together. Now, that doesn't stop people from trying, and that's what we call theistic evolution, where they'll kind of suggest that God let stuff stew for a couple of million years, and then He came back to it, and so that's how the days passed, right? That word day, that's what they'll argue, is that they'll say, well, the word day, is actually meaning 2 millions of years. Let's look at the text, right? So I'd encourage you to get your Bible out, take a look there real quick. And we're going to look at Genesis 1, verse 5, and then we're going to jump to verses 8, 13, 19, 23, and 31. And you're going to notice a very easy pattern here. Right, so verse 5, right? God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Okay, jump to verse 8. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. Verse 13. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning the third day. Then to verse 19. And there was evening, and there was morning the fourth day. Verse 23. And there was evening, and there was morning the fifth day. And then verse 31. That's going to be on the next page in my Bible. And behold, and God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good, and there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day, right? So we have evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, over and over again. And so that word there in the Hebrew, the word yom, is talking about a 24-hour day. There are exceptions when it means more than that, but that's when it's used in poetry, that what is it, like a year to the Lord is, or a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, right? It's talking in the poetic terms there. Or if it's talking about the final day, the day of the Lord, when Christ returns in all His glory to judge the heavens and the earth. And so the text itself says 6 days. That is how God created all things, and that was the time frame. Now, people might disagree with that, they might argue against that, but that's what the text says. And so theistic evolution is shot down. Now, this is not a new debate. This is something that people have been arguing for centuries. right? The guy that we talked about, Athanasius, he wrote a book on the incarnation of Jesus, and he talks about this. He talks about those who are trying to change God into something that he's not, right? That he'll talk about, oh boy, Plato, for instance. That Plato would argue, that there was kind of this pre-existing matter that had always been there, and that it was then we were fashioned out of this pre-existent material. And then some Christians try to kind of harmonize with that. But that actually gives God weakness. Right? There's a difference between God shaping stuff out of material versus God creating. Right? If you think about it, I mean, a carpenter, right, to be somebody who works with wood, right? What do you need in order to make a chair? Right? You need a saw, you need a plane, you need, a whole bunch of tools, and you need wood. Without the wood, you can have all the tools, but you're not going to make the chair. So the wood is necessary, and the carpenter, without the wood, can't be a carpenter, right? So we talk about God as a creator, right? What does a creator need? And that's the answer, right? The answer to that is that a creator needs nothing, right? He creates, he makes all things. And so people who kind of go down this theistic evolution road, they change who God is and actually make him weaker. Right? And that's kind of the thing. I mean, so theistic evolution, not really something that is compatible with the Christian faith. Because once again, that is not what the text says, and the Apostles' Creed here, right, just affirms that I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Right? So he has made all things. He is our creator. All right. Now, why is there this battle between evolution and creation, right? It's been going on. I mean, Athanasius was back in the 4th century, so at least 1,600 years. And if he's talking about Plato and his incarnation, that's going back thousands of years at this point. So, I mean, it's been around, and this debate's been going on. So why is there such a battle about it? Well, if you look at creationists and evolutionists, we use similar stuff. We use the same facts, right? We have the same material world. We have the same sun, moon, stars, right? All of those things that are around us. We use the same scientific methods, right? Empiricism works not only for Christians, but for non-Christians, right? So we use the same science. Why then do we have such different conclusions? And this is a very important thing for us to kind of keep in mind, in anything in life. And so some old phrases, right? Failing to plan means you are, right, planning to fail. If all your cooking ingredients are rotten, then your meal is already spoiled. Right? You're not going to bring them back from that, right? I mean, you can try and you can cover it with spices, but there's a limit. So we might say that your beginning point determines your result. Right? The assumptions that you go in to this debate with, or as you look at this, will determine where you end up. Right? So I'm not surprised that people don't believe that there is a creator when they don't have faith. Right? They don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They don't believe that God, made the heavens and the earth and them. So yeah, of course, I'm not surprised when I run into folks who deny this that aren't Christians. But if you're Christian, don't embrace the other worldview. So the real issue here is that evolutionists begin with the assumption that there is nothing supernatural. Now, when I talk about something being supernatural, I'm not talking about the TV show with two brothers, nor am I talking about ghosts and goblins and all those other things that we see on TV, or zombies, right? That's the other big one right now that we see on TV. But when I'm talking about something that is supernatural, I'm going back to kind of the old definition of the word, that there is something that is above nature, right? So there's something outside of this physical world, and there is something that is above it, right? So because if you're a naturalist, that means, like, for instance, you don't believe in a soul, right? I mean, because a soul would be super natural, above the natural order, the natural world. And so so evolutionists start with that assumption that there is nothing supernatural, and therefore every time they see patterns that point to a designer or a creator or a maker, they ignore them. And so, they might try to go about, well, what about fossils, right? This is kind of another big thing. I mean, how did the fossils get down there and get so old, right? But if we ask ourselves the question, how does something get covered up so fast, right, that it could be encased in mud, and then and some of them died in this whole process? Because when I was taught about fossils, I was taught that, they died in a swamp, they went slowly down, and they were covered up by mud, and then, it all worked out as their bones, as the tissue was replaced with minerals. But we have fossils all around the world, and they all got covered up rather quickly, because some were even caught giving birth, right? That's an awkward moment to be covered up at. It would take something cataclysmic, and the Bible talks about that. If you open to Genesis chapter 7 verse 11, right, let's turn there real quick and let's see what it has to say. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 7th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. That marks the start of an event that we know as the flood, when the entire earth was thrown into turmoil. Right now, if you want to check out Answers in Genesis, there's a pretty good video on this about the flood when the great fountains of the deep burst forth, as the whole earth was flooded. And it covered over everything. And so that's why too, when you look at fossils and you see the different degrees, that you have, what they use to kind of prove that animals came, from the oceans onto the land, and that's why the animals that were fossilized, lower down were, fish or other small things, and then by the time they got up to the top level, you had kind of the bigger animals. And that's not an order of evolution, that's an order of burial. Because if the fountains of the great deep burst forth, then the first things to get buried would be stuff on the seabed, followed by the fish, followed by the animals that are on the land as the waves start to take it over. Okay, so there are explanations for these things. And then, people ask, well, if this was this giant cataclysmic flood, the fountains of the deep burst forth, then wouldn't we have evidence of it still today, especially if it happened in the last, 6 to 10,000 years? And you say, we do. We have evidence of it. Most of us, find it rather majestic when we visit some of those places. You'll find it, over in the Grand Canyon here in the United States. At a spot where the fountains of the deep burst forth. Or if you go over to the Bahamas and you look off the coast of the Bahamas, you'll have something called the tongue of the ocean, which dives down quite deep and is this giant trench. You got the Marianas Trench out in the Pacific Ocean. You have the Rift Valley, which starts up in the northern part of Israel and stretches all the way down into Africa. Right? Jerusalem's on a mountain, right, high up, and then the Dead Sea is the lowest point. I think it's still the lowest point, but the very low point here on Earth. There's another place like the Grand Canyon over in Europe. I believe it's over by Serbia or Yugoslavia, somewhere in that area, Bosnia, something like that. But you have another one of those canyons, right? So all across the planet you have this evidence of stuff that you've got these giant chasms that just showed up. Right? Sure, maybe a little river did it, over whatever time frame you're using, but if it fits with the Bible and Jesus goes with the Bible, then the world will start making more sense as you start examining it and considering these positions. And so that's where we talk about that our position and our belief is not unreasonable. It actually fits the material world pretty well and explains what's going on. So let's see. All right, so it's not just that rain fell, but the reservoirs underground blasted out like geysers around the world. And okay, there we go. I've just talked about all that. And then we got carbon-14 dating, right? But what about that? It says stuff is super old. But if you remember the candle, right, who was there to measure the original amount of carbon-14? Right? Carbon-14 is making some assumptions about the amount of carbon that was in the animals, but it cannot prove it. Because once again, there was no one there to make a record of it. And if the bones were sitting there, as they say, millions of years, I can think back within my own lifetime of just the number of earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, all these other things that have changed the landscape and caused turmoil. And you're telling me nothing happened over your millions of years? Right? It's a little suspicious. Especially then when we find evidence of, they just found a creature that had material preserved in its stomach, which is impressive, right? If that stuff preserved for millions of years, or we found there was a microbiologist. He found, tissue samples from the dinosaurs. We've got all of this stuff, which does not suggest millions of years, but it's more reasonable to believe thousands of years. So, and this is why, we stick with what the scripture says. It is not an unreasonable belief to believe that God created all things in 6 days. It's just not. So you can, feel confident that Christians, they're not crazy, that they believe that the earth was created in 6 days. All right, we just don't, we just believe there is something supernatural, and that is God. So what does that mean? It does mean dinosaurs and men existed at the same time. We also believe that dinosaurs were alive in the last 6,000 years. Right? That once again explains why some of the tissue samples have survived. And people wonder, well, where were they then? Well, the word dinosaur came into use in the 1800s. But before that, there's another word that starts with D, and that is dragon. And so sure enough, as you look back at the history, you will find accounts of dragons spread across the globe. These scaly monsters. Now, the fire breathing was probably a bit of embellishment, don't get me wrong. But you have these scaly beasts that were terrorizing, and of course, we're going to kill something like that. We're not going to let it live. So, yeah, dinosaurs were alive in the last 6,000 years, and that some did survive the flood, as recorded in the book of Job. If you turn to the later chapters of Job, he describes two beasts, Behemoth and Leviathan. And if you read the descriptions and you think about dinosaurs, they fit. And there we go, I already said that. So the question, of course, then too, that I get from folks is, well, how did they fit on the ark? Right? How are you going to get dinosaurs on the ark? Now, often when I wrestled with this as well, because when I think of a dinosaur, I don't think of some small little creature. I think of we think about the Brachiosaur. What is that one called? Oh boy. We think of the big dinosaurs, right? We think of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. We think of, the giant leaf eaters, right? That these are going to be the ones that are going to give trouble on the ark. But there's some simple answers for that. Number one, babies aren't big, right? And if you are taking a bunch of animals on a boat and you need them to be on there for an extended period of time, you don't want a full-grown dinosaur who is going to be eating adult-sized portions and have an adult-sized poop, right? That's just a whole other problem. But you will want babies, especially when you consider that an older dinosaur, right, would already have passed some of its years for making babies, right? Whereas the little dinosaur, got time yet, right? So yeah, this is how it's not, it's reasonable, right? It's possible. And so what about evolution in our society? All right, so questions that we can ask our society when it comes to evolution. And this is where you can kind of get a little, you can be a gadfly, as it were. If evolution is about the survival of the fittest, right? So why do we let the weaker members of our society survive? Right? To just think about it reasonably and rationally, it doesn't make sense, right? Because then if we let the weaker members of our society survive and procreate, then we're letting weakness flood throughout our society, and that's not good for us as a species. Now, I am not advocating that position, right? Just want to be clear. But it is a question that we need to consider. I mean, especially if somebody claims to be an evolutionist, then why are they living against it, right? Why make a law mandating that everybody has to wear seatbelts, right? That's a good decision. You want to let the dumb people weed themselves out, right? I mean, if you're about survival of the fittest, once again, I think we should keep people safe, and I think it's good to have seatbelts. But my mindset is not that of survival of the fittest, right? I believe that all human life has value and is precious in the sight of God, for God created mankind. All right. Then we can also ask, how far back does recorded history go? And you'll find it goes back a couple thousand years, well, several thousand years. And so, yeah, once again, doesn't that seem odd that it only goes back several thousand years? Because communicating is something that is quite important to the human race, and keeping records, especially if you're talking about taxes or merchants or anything like that, is vital. And so, yeah, recorded history, how far back do we have? And then some other questions, if you get into debates with folks, with especially with creation evolution, you can ask them about the experiment that disproved spontaneous generation. And spontaneous generation is where a gentleman, they used to believe that that meat, eventually turned into maggots. Just a natural process for meat, right? It turns into maggots. I would not buy meat from their meat markets, but a guy did an experiment, and he covered one beaker of meat with cheesecloth to keep flies from it, and the other beaker of meat he left open to the air. The beaker that was left open to the air did develop maggots. The beaker that was covered with the cheesecloth did not. And so that was kind of the classic experiment that showed that spontaneous generation doesn't happen. There's something going on with the flies. They were laying eggs that caused suddenly the meat to have maggots. And so with evolution, if you are saying that at one point there was no life and then suddenly life came into existence, you are teaching something that science has disproved. Why do you hold the spontaneous generation, which was shown to be false several hundred years ago? Right? But this, once again, right, it comes back to that question of, where is your starting point? If you don't believe that there is a God or anything supernatural, then the only explanation you've got left is nature. And that leads you to evolution. But yeah, once again, it falls apart. So, let's see. But so if we lose creation, though, we lose the gospel, because what creation reveals to us is that there is a God who is active in the world, right? He's interested in the world. He's created all things, and he sustains us, right? He gave us his breath, right? His spirit, that we might have life. And so that's not a God who is far off, but a God who is with us. More than that, he cares about the world, right? He didn't turn his back on it and forsake it. He still is there watching over the world and its people. And then, more than that, he provides for you all that you need, right? He is a good and gracious God that watches over all of creation. This is why a lot of folks, we're going through this pandemic right now. Oh, this is 2020. It's a fun year, yeah, if you're watching this in the future. But we had a pandemic sweep through, and people are they're in a bunch of upset and an uproar, and there's a lot of panic and anxiety and worry flooding the world. But we know as Christians that if God is in control of all things and watching over all things, and this means that even though we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, that we're going to be okay. So don't panic, right? Be at peace. And then This also, right, if you have a creator, you have a maker, that means that you are here for a reason. You have value, you have meaning, you have purpose, right? Your life is not just some accident, and you didn't just win the race to be born. God wanted you here. Now, to do what? That I don't know, but that doesn't change the fact that you have a purpose, right? And this is something where if we start to lose these things, we lose a lot of hope, and we're left on our own trying to figure out our purpose and our meaning, and we as people, we aren't good at that. So let's turn here real quick to Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16. Oh goodness, I'm in the major prophets. All right, Psalm 139. Yep, this gives you time to find it. And 13 through 16. And here it says, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." Right? God wanted you to be here. Right? And this is a wonderful blessing that we have, knowing that we have a creator, that you're not an accident, you're not a mistake, that God really did want you to be here on earth. Now, what purpose that has, I don't know yet, right? I don't know you, but God does have a purpose and plan in mind for you. And so don't panic, right? Do what's right, abide by those things that we have in the 10 Commandments. But, right, the wonderful news, the wonderful gospel that we have is that you have a creator who still cares about you to this very day. So rejoice in that. All right. Well, thank you guys for your time. If you have any questions, please be sure to shoot me an email and let me know. And I will be, let's see, and we'll be following this up. We'll continue in the first article still for a little bit because we got some more stuff to talk about. But you guys have a wonderful day, and God bless.